Hello, and welcome again to Ethics and Leadership, where I'm very excited today to have our special guest, Jeremy Bentham, on with us. Now, I know that in the past I've had some fun with our pictured guests for the lectures, but today I have Bentham with us in an entirely more creepy way. You see, this is Jeremy Bentham. I mean, he's dead, but this is Jeremy Bentham. Weird story about Bentham. He had kind of a wicked sense of humor and a deep dislike for religion. So he decided when he died that he would like to be mummified and kept on the college campus and occasionally wheeled out for board meetings and such. So after his death, his friends went along with him. They actually did a public autopsy of his body, and then they basically mummified him. Now, this isn't entirely Bentham, actually, though. I mean, the body is actually Bentham, but the head isn't. You see, the mummification process it's not pretty what comes out on the far side necessarily. And his face was kind of sunken and well, I mean, it was mummified. It's brown and all kind of creepy. They put into it a set of glass eyes that Bentham carried around with him when he was alive to show off what he'd have put in his head when he was dead. So it's just kind of creepy brown face that just looks at you with these bright blue eyes. I mean, if you want to, you could Google it and you would just Bentham's head and you'll get a picture of it, I'm sure. And the body is regularly on display at a university in London. Although he has in fact been wheeled out for some parties and occasional meeting, and at one point he was actually took a trip over to the United States and was shown off there. So, you know, if you want to get to be friends with Bentham, still possible. Kind of creepy way. In any case, he's going to be sitting there while we go through his theories. Hope he doesn't move. So, for the last 3 lectures, we've been looking at people who are pretty much in the center of what we might call the liberal tradition. That tradition which starts most clearly with Locke, although it has some foreshadowing in some of the language and ideas that Hobbes puts forward. But that tradition that's focused on the tradition of natural rights, which are negative rights. In general, my right to be a particular individual, to own myself, my own actions, my own property. Well, when looking at Jeremy Bentham, we're going to go in a little bit of a different direction. Bentham still exists within a tradition of liberalism, and as a matter of fact, he would have fought for several rights beyond even what the natural rights tradition that runs through Locke, Wollstonecraft, and Douglas argues for. But he does this on a very different ground. Jeremy Bentham was a legal scholar, and he rejected the ideas of natural and divine law. He was not in favor of religion, as I've noted before. He actually took his body and, well, we just talked about that. So he doesn't believe in God, he doesn't believe in God-given rules, and he doesn't believe that nature has given us a particular set of absolute rights. Rather, he starts his moral theory someplace different. Bentham is altogether more Hobbesian in his starting place. So if we rewind back to Hobbes, we will get to the point that you remember that he had people who he broke down as individuals, and then he even went so far as to talk about their inner workings as if these people are just machines. So that the movements inside of them give rise to particular feelings that want to keep the particular movements going, like the movement of the blood and everything else. And so people are basically machines that are working out just a set of given appetites that they have. They might be able to modify these somewhat, but for the most part, want comes before the good. You figure out what you want, and that becomes good for you. Well, this is much more similar to the picture that Bentham is picking up here. Bentham being the guy who has Hobbes' face on him right now, because he doesn't have his own face, because it turned brown. But with Hobbes, and actually going beyond Hobbes, Jeremy Bentham also was in favor of a kind of rationalism. Now you remember that with Hobbes, rationalism came to fore when the person got focused on their own fear, and this allowed them to use their instrumental rationality to figure out how they were going to achieve security in the midst of the state of nature. Well, Bentham has a little bit higher hopes, and as a matter of fact believes that the more rational a person will become, the more moral they'll become, because he imagines rationality as a generalizing function. So we start out with our own desires, our own purposes, the things that we choose. We are individuals who decide what we want. But we can apply our reason and generalize that to other people and say, you know what, if I have my particular wants and desires, other people have their particular wants and desires. And the more rational I become, the more I'll be able to recognize that I'm a person like other people are, and so my particular desires should not have any advantage over other people's particular desires. So I'll overcome my own egoism, moving towards a more universal ethic that allows me to recognize the particularity of all people as they go about wanting what they want and hopefully getting what they want at some point. I mean, just as much as I hopefully get what I want at any given point. So this brings us to the development of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism isn't a word that Bentham used. As a matter of fact, it was developed by the later scholar John Stuart Mill, who studied with Bentham and took utilitarianism in some very different directions from those that Bentham laid out at first. Today we're going to focus on Jeremy Bentham, but I'm going to use the term utilitarianism to talk about him because it's just usually the way that people talk about Bentham. So, Bentham suggested that we could, in fact, embrace a formula for rational morality, which would allow us to be the most rational creatures that we could be, or at least assess actions and policies as the most rational moral creatures that we could be. So the formula goes like this. You ought to do that which brings about the greatest happiness of the greatest number. Seems pretty clear, right? Well, no, not entirely. Actually, it's not clear what he means by happiness and what you might think that he means by greatest number. You might think he's just going with the majority here or something like that. So really, we ought to do more to figure out exactly what this formula means before we talk about its advantages or disadvantages in any way. So first, let's fill out what Bentham means by happiness. So at times, Aristotle's concept of eudaimonia gets translated as happiness, like the person who has the fulfilled life is the most happy. And as a matter of fact, even going back to Plato in his dialogue with Thrasymachus, some people say, well, their argument is about whether or not justice makes you happy. But of course, in those pictures, what Aristotle has in mind is the fulfilled life, which is filled with a whole bunch of different goods that can't be reduced to any single picture of the good or any single term. So eudaimonia isn't very usefully reduced to a picture of happiness, which gives rise to like the idea of positive feelings or something like that. Similarly for Plato, the idea of a particular emotion or the experience of a particular appetite was not what Plato was after at all when he talked about what the good life would be. But by the time we get to Bentham, when he's talking about happiness, he actually does mean to draw upon the tradition of hedonism. Now, we saw that before with Locke, and Locke sometimes talks in terms of our moral experiences somehow growing from some base experience of pleasure and pain. And this is more similar to the idea that Bentham has Except for that, when we go back to Locke, it seems that if Locke is talking in terms of pleasure and pain, he probably has an idea that there's some given human nature that makes things more pleasurable or more painful for us. For Bentham, there is no such underlying structure. There is pleasure and pain, and he reduces what's good to whatever is pleasurable for the person, and he reduces whatever's bad to whatever causes a person to experience pain. So Bentham thinks that this provides us with a way that we can actually universalize our own experiences. Because while I can't universalize my own particular desires, maybe I like playing the piccolo and you like playing the... Maybe you don't like playing anything. Maybe you just don't like music, right? That's just not your dig, man. But whatever it is that we prefer, the things that we prefer give us pleasure. So in talking about pleasure and pain, we find a category that can run across all of us, despite the fact that we, in fact, desire very different things from each other. So when we're talking about utilitarianism, you'll be able to exchange these terms. If we talk about happiness, we're talking about pleasure. And if we talk about unhappiness, or sadness maybe, we'll be talking about pain. Because those are really the two basic structures of morality. Those are the only goods and the only evils in the entire world. Now, Bentham's focus on preference in order to find what's pleasurable is somewhat controversial. And even in later forms of utilitarianism, this gets kind of rearranged. John Stuart Mill, who I mentioned before, will challenge this idea because he thinks it has the potential for debasing humans. I mean, what if it's the fact that somebody just prefers rolling around in the mud like a pig? Does that then become the good life for them? Well, it seems that according to Bentham, it actually does. Because Bentham really doubles down on this idea that preference comes before pleasure. Prejudice apart, he says, the game of pushpin is of equal value with the arts and sciences of music and poetry. So what he's saying here is that you probably have never played pushpin. I've never played pushpin, but apparently it was a game in the Victorian era where people they'd put pins on a table and maybe they'd push the pins. I don't know, maybe it's like pickup sticks or something. I mean, we could probably think in terms of tic-tac-toe and chess, right? So it might appear that these two games are different, like substantially different from each other, so that if somebody gets pleasure from playing tic-tac-toe and that's the same amount of pleasure that they get from playing chess, we might be like, oh, well, that person maybe isn't as cultured as somebody else or doesn't have as developed a sense of pleasures as the other person does. But Bentham doesn't really have time for this. He says, no, whatever it is that, floats your boat, that's just whatever floats your boat. We don't have to talk about what are better pleasures or worse pleasures or what are appropriate human pleasures and inappropriate human pleasures. None of that should really play a part. Human beings just determine what their own pleasures are. And if somebody's interested in one of these things and not the other, that's just the way they are. We can see here why utilitarianism is a fairly progressive form of ethics, especially in a time when people are pushing forms of aristocracy. Because the aristocrats, of course, would be the people who claim to have more refined senses for these things. The fact that they've been trained in things like music and poetry and all of those diverse areas of practice, they think, in fact, makes them better at perceiving what should be pleasurable or what should not be pleasurable. But Bentham is kind of a sincere Democrat in this. He doesn't think that the desires or pleasures of any particular people should be over the pleasures of any other people, which is a fairly radical idea at the time and even afterwards. So if the first marker of utilitarianism is the idea that it is a form of hedonism, which makes pleasure and pain most central to its account of the good, another facet of utilitarianism is that it's consequentialist. Now, that's a big term, so what does it mean? Well, in order to talk about that, we need to get back into a discussion of means and ends. So you remember back when we were with Machiavelli, we talked about particular means in order to achieve some ends that we wanted to achieve. So that's the way that we get to the goal that we have set. The means are the ways that we go about it, and the goal is that we have as our, well, it's the ends that are set there in front of us. So means and ends are central to just about every moral system. As a matter of fact, we can see this with the natural rights tradition that we've been talking about. So what could one do in order to increase pleasure in a particular society in the natural rights system? Well, you could do lots of things to try and make things more pleasurable for people, but there are a set of means that you cannot undertake. So even if it would make it more pleasurable on the whole for a society if you took the wealth of particular people away, took away their property, well, that's not a justification for taking away their property. You see, if people have rights, then there are some means which we can't undertake, because those rights mean these are kind of unbreakable things. So even if it would help us achieve a goal, we can't just violate somebody else's rights or, well, let me give you a concrete example. So imagine that somebody's gone into a QT, a Quick Trip, or a gas station, wherever you're from. I don't even know that we have QTs around here. So an Amico station or one of those with the dinosaur thingy on the outside. So somebody's gone in and they've taken hostages. And there are 10 hostages inside the store. And the person is basically in a frantic mental state. They're not even sure exactly what they want. And so they start saying, well, you know what? I'm going to start killing one of the hostages every 10 seconds. And they haven't even made any clear demands that you could answer in order to resolve this. And outside, you're the police officer in charge of resolving this situation, this hostage standoff. Now, in order to make this a proper thought experiment, we have to specify that there's no way you can't shoot the person's out of, there's no way that you can actually stop this by direct intervention in the case. You can't raid the place or anything like that in order to stop the person. But there is one option. A psychologist who has worked with this person on the inside comes up to you and says, okay, here's the case. If that person were to witness something that were really, really traumatic for them, extremely traumatic, then that person would go into a catatonic state. And here the psychologist in our thought experiment has absolute knowledge. So they know that if the person experienced something that would be really devastating to them, they would go into a catatonic state. You'd be able to go in, grab them, pull them out, and all 10 people would be able to survive from inside the gas station. And so you look around really quickly to think, is there anything that we could do that would be incredibly devastating to this person? Because, I mean, what do we have that they actually care about out here without going in? Well, here it turns out that the person's daughter has come by. They're worried about him, and so the 11-year-old daughter has come by and they're worried about their father or mother, whoever's taken the hostages inside. And so you pull up the daughter in front of the QT and you pull out your gun and you think, you know what? If I just put my gun to this kid's head and I pull the trigger, well, that would be devastating to the guy, right? I mean, that would bring him to a catatonic state. So, should I do this? Should I, in fact, kill the daughter in order to save the 10 people inside? Right? How do we figure out what to do? Well, it depends a great deal on whether you put emphasis on rights or whether you're a kind of consequentialist. So, do you want to save the most lives? That might be your goal, right? So, do you believe that there are limits on the means that you can use in order to save those lives? Or do you believe that in order to achieve the proper end, you just should do whatever you have to do? Well, it seems that in this kind of case, now realize that it's not a realistic case, and the utilitarian would have all sorts of problems with it because you don't know exactly what's going to happen, etc., etc., and you have to do calculation. But at this point, the utilitarian, given all the constraints that we have, it seems like the utilitarian might say, yeah, in fact, you should shoot the daughter. And as a matter of fact, that's what you have to do in order to bring about the proper consequence. So utilitarianism is about consequences. The natural law tradition, as an alternative, would say, no, you shouldn't shoot this girl because that would be a violation of the girl's rights. Her ownership of herself, her life, her own activity, she has rights, and you can't just violate those rights, even if it's to achieve a good end that you have in sight. As a matter of fact, you could say, okay, so if he's going to kill the 10 people inside, that's something he's doing. So he's being the immoral one by violating the 10 people's rights. But that doesn't mean that you should be immoral too by violating this particular girl's rights. So if we go absolutely with either one of these approaches, we're going to have very different conclusions that we come out with. Utilitarianism says, in general, we should go with the consequences. We should focus on what brings about the greatest amount of pleasure. And if we have to do something that might not seem right in the process, well, that's just what we have to do. Perhaps more in the utilitarian's defense, if we don't go with this principle, what happens even if the number becomes incredibly large? What if it's 11 million people? What if it's 20 million people? What if the person has his hand on a button that would set off a nuclear explosion that would destroy the United States and the rest of the world? At what point do you say, you know what, the consequences actually outweigh the rights of this one person? Or do you ever? So there are actual historical cases where this comes up. Take, for instance, the end of World War II, where the United States calculates that it will kill so many more people to end the war in a direct assault on Japan that it makes more sense to drop 2 nuclear bombs, even though in that process we're not targeting people who are military members, we're targeting civilian centers, we're targeting cities. This is very similar to the case of the person that's holding hostages. Now, we haven't said enough to actually resolve the real-life case of the use of nuclear weapons because there's a whole bunch of other issues that should come in. But at least there's some historical parallel, and the leaders of the United States actually took the shot. So it's worth thinking about. At what point does utilitarianism and consequentialism become the ethics that you actually accept? Now, one other thing that we should say here. So I put Machiavelli in a fairly similar state to what we find here in utilitarianism, but I'm going to make one qualification. So Machiavelli, I said, does not in fact go all the way to saying that the end fully justifies the means that you have to use. He kind of said, you know what, it doesn't justify it, but you have to do it anyway. So if you have to torture people in order to bring about peace, that's just what you have to do. That doesn't make torturing people good. It just makes it something you have to do. So sometimes you have to do evil things in order to achieve good ends. Well, the utilitarian wants to go a step further and say, no, actually, if the means are necessary in order to bring about the good end, then those means become good. You shouldn't feel bad about having done it at all, because that is just what became right. If the total calculation produced the greatest amount of pleasure, then you did what's right, and there's no real second thoughts about it. You ought to go on and think, well, that's just what I had to do. I did the right thing. Okay, going on, I want to think about a third piece of utilitarianism, which is utilitarianism and the form of equality that it endorses. Now, there are actually 2 different forms of equality that I want to talk about here, because while it's egalitarian, that means equalitarian, that means just equal in some sense. It's not equal in all senses. And this gets to that last bit of the formula, do the greatest good for the greatest number, which doesn't really mean the greatest number of people, even though it sounds like that. But it means that you're supposed to bring about the greatest aggregate amount of pleasure that you can. That's really abstract, so we ought to say something more about the two kinds of equality that we want to talk about. So one kind of equality is an equality of attention. So in utilitarianism, I have to pay attention to everyone's particular claims about happiness, the pleasure and the pain that it creates for each person. And this goes back to what we were saying before. There's no sense in which the aristocrat's pleasure or pain is weighed more than the common person's pleasure or pain. We have to pay attention to everybody's pleasure or pain equally. So, for instance, if you have a choice between making your mom happy or making somebody else happy, and it makes an equal amount of pleasure, well, you shouldn't have a real preference between those two. You should just say, no, it's fine, because it produces the same amount of overall pleasure. If it makes somebody else more pleasurable, let's say you got a present and you can give it to your mom or you can give it to somebody else, it makes the other person more happy to give them that same gift, well, at that point, you should give it to the other person, because it makes no difference whether it's your mom or somebody else. We need to pay attention equally to all people, and we need to calculate their pleasures as being equal to each other, no matter their relationship to us or anything else. This is one of the factors of utilitarianism that has made it a good source for arguments for global justice, as people oftentimes are more willing to give to people that they see, people who are closer to them, people who are members of their own nation or whatever else. But some utilitarians, like the contemporary utilitarian theorist Peter Singer, have argued that, as a matter of fact, this doesn't make sense. Because if you give gifts of equal value to you to people in poorer nations, they will in fact bring about a greater amount of pleasure than if you give them to people who exist in your own nation, at least if you live in a wealthier nation. So, for instance, if I give a kid a set of Nike shoes here, right, that'll make them fairly happy, somewhat happy. But what if I took that money that I spent on Nikes and I gave it to poor kids someplace in an underdeveloped country? Well, it might buy fairly good shoes for a whole bunch of kids. And each one of them might be much more excited about the shoes that they got, because not only did they not have Nikes, they just didn't have any shoes to begin with. So at that point, that seems like what we should do with our money. We should give it to people where it'll have the greatest amount of impact. So utilitarianism stresses this kind of equality, an equality of attention to people and an equality of the balancing of their particular pleasures that they get out of the goods that they receive. The other one is an equality of distribution. So does this mean that we should in fact equally distribute the goods that we have? Should we be concerned about fairness in distributing the goods that we have? Well, no, not particularly. As a matter of fact, in that last example, we suggested that it makes more sense to give more stuff to the people in poorer countries than it does to give stuff to people in richer countries. That actually seems like it makes sense. But we might also say that it makes sense to give stuff to people who can experience happiness. So, for instance, imagine that we've got one person who's in a coma and another person who's alive and aware, and we don't have any expectations that the person in a coma is going to wake up anytime soon. Well, which one of them should we give more medical attention to? We should give more attention to the person who in fact has the experience of pleasure rather than the person who doesn't have experience of pleasure. Because assuming that the person in a coma is not having experiences of pleasure, I'm assuming that at this point. And as a matter of fact, as we go on, there will be questions for utilitarians that are raised about people who, as they get older, while we spend more and more money on them in terms of health. Their health is degrading, so the amount of pleasure that they're actually getting out of their lives is decreasing as the amount of resources that we spend on them is increasing. And so at what point should we say, you know what, this isn't a good way to distribute our goods? We shouldn't attribute people a kind of fundamental right to life, which we're going to be worried about, and say, we'll spend whatever is necessary in order to make sure you live as long as possible. We should make rational calculations that say, well, how much pleasure are they actually getting out of it? So while we don't pay differential amounts of attention to different people, we do pay attention to the amounts of pleasure that they're able to experience, how much pleasure they have left to experience in their life, and etc. So we might be able to favor giving things to younger people over giving things to older people because they have different amounts of pleasure in front of them. Right? So there is no requirement in utilitarianism that we embrace any particular account of distributive justice or equality in distribution of goods, because all of the decisions there are going to come about in terms of happiness. Or to put this a different way, if we were to go back to a kind of proportionate equality. So remember back with Aristotle, we said, well, there's like numeric equality where we actually give everybody exactly the same amount of something, so they're numerically equal. But there's also proportionate equality. We treat people equal in proportion to something else. We might be able to put utilitarianism in a way into this framework. So we could say each is due that which creates the greatest net social utility. So pleasure minus pain in the overall situation. That's a big mouthful, and I don't know that it makes for a good account of proportionate, because it's not actually necessarily in relation to any proportion to the person, but it is in relation to what produces the greatest amount of pleasure overall, and that's really what the utilitarian is concerned with. All right. So at this point, we could go to another facet of utilitarianism, which is hedonic calculus. So hedonic calculus is a calculation that you have to do. All of this ends up getting fairly complicated and fairly fast as you get into utilitarianism, because while utilitarianism boils all goods down to pleasure and pain, it recognizes that you have to be enlightened about all the different facets of pleasure and pain that ought to be taken into account as you're calculating things. So Bentham, as a matter of fact, develops this whole list of different variables that you should take into account in hedonic calculus. So, for instance, intensity. How strong is the pleasure that you're going for? Duration. How long will the pleasure last? Certainty or uncertainty. How likely or unlikely is it that the pleasure will occur? Because you're not sure when you make the decision exactly what the outcome's going to be. Propinquity, which is my favorite. I mean, I like the word propinquity in general. That gives me pleasure. But what he means by it here is how soon the pleasure will occur, because apparently quickly occurring pleasure is better than far off occurring pleasure. It produces more pleasure immediately. Maybe it makes it more likely that it'll come about. Fecundity, the probability that the action will be followed by sensations of the same kind. Purity, the probability that it will not be followed by sensations of the opposite kind. So if I do something pleasurable now, right, if I eat the whole pizza, well, that over the long run, make me, I don't know, right? So you got to figure out what's the probability of that. And extent, how many people are going to be affected and how will they be affected? So at this point, let's try doing a little bit of hedonic calculus. And in order to do this, it's a form of math. So I'm going to do my full-on math thing where I got to get fully geeked out. Just a second here. All right, so I'm ready to do math. Leave it to a philosophy professor to make fun of math people. So let's do some hedonic calculus. In order to do hedonic calculus, we need to imagine that there are two possible scenarios, two options for something. So let's think of a case that we might take. All right, imagine that there's a girl. The girl's name is Katie, and so we'll go with a K for that. And then Katie is dating, let's see, Lucas. So we'll go with an L for Lucas. And then she's got this person that she's met in her online class. She's seen him via the forums there. And she thinks that his posts are quite attractive, if you get what I mean. So that person is going to be, I mean, whatever you want. You can name them as you like. But I'm going to go with Tobias. So we got T. Now, the question is Katie going to cheat on Lucas with Tobias? I'm assuming that they're within, like, driving distance. They can figure out wherever they are and whatever else. And Tobias is, like, open to this. And so let's assume all of this is going to happen. So we have two different scenarios, two possibilities here. And we have another one with our K, our L, and their T. So above will be section 1, option 1, and below will be option 2, so that we get our two options. And so 1 is going to be cheat, and 2 is going to be no cheat. Okay, so let's do our calculating here. So what if Katie does cheat, right? Well, then how much pleasure does Katie get out of this experience? Well, we don't know much about Tobias, but I'm going to assume he's a usual guy. I mean, so she'll get some pleasure out of it. It'll be okay. We'll say that she gets four pleasure out of the experience, right? Now, what do we say, like, Tobias gets out of this? What's Tobias's pleasure? Well, he's a typical guy, and, getting together with a girl, so let's say he gets, like, 10 pleasure out of it. He enjoys this. Then we need to figure out, since the people that we're going to account for here, it might go beyond this, right? If we were doing a real hedonic calculus, we'd have to figure out about Kate's friends, and Lucas's friends, and maybe Tobias's friends, and the members of the class. We'll have to deal with the aftermath and whatever else. We're going to keep this as simple as we can, so we just got Lucas here. So Lucas, well, it depends, right? So is Lucas going to find out about the cheating, or is he not going to find out about the cheating, right? And what are the options? So if he doesn't find out about the cheating, if this doesn't come out, then presumably Lucas is going to be affected like zero. He's not going to get any happiness or unhappiness out of it. If she doesn't, like, break up with him for Tobias at some point in the future, this isn't going to affect him at all, right? I mean, Tobias is fine being the kind of guy on the side, the side dude, and whatever. So he gets zero out of it. But if he does find out, how unhappy is he going to be? Well, let's say he's going to be significantly unhappy, right? So he's going to be like negative, let's give him a negative 10. Right? And so, what are the chances that he figures it out? Let's say it's 50%. So we're going to take each of those times 0.5 in order to take into account the probability that he actually finds out. So that makes that actually a negative 5, and then we've got the 0, and we come out with a total of negative 5. Now, okay, so at that point, that's the first instance of pleasure or pain. Now, what are the chances that on down the road this produces more pleasure or pain for the people involved? Well, let's assume that it's a one-time thing that this happens. And so Kate afterwards, she feels a little bit of regret, or maybe she feels a lot of regret, especially if Lucas fills out. So then we need to figure out what are the chances that Lucas figured out, and then what are the differentials for the kind of pleasure and pain that Katie experiences. And then we'd have to figure out the chances for Lucas, and then on down if he finds out, and if he doesn't find out, and if he continues not to find out, right? And then what are the outcomes for Tobias? So maybe he, even if it was just one-time thing, he can remember it and he feels kind of pleasurable. So let's for right now, we won't do all of those calculations. We'll just call it a wash, and we'll do our total at this point. And so let's just take the first iteration, and we say, okay, so she got 4 pleasure, he got minus 5 pleasure, Tobias got 10 pleasure. So we've got a total here of 5 and 4, and that's so a total of 9 pleasure. It's a total positive of 9 that we get coming out of this. Okay, let's go down to non-cheat. So if Katie doesn't cheat, let's say what happens to her? How much is she disappointed? Is she maybe she's disappointed. Maybe she's like 1. She thinks -1. -1 because she's disappointed. So that's a point of pain for her. She wonders what would have happened in the process. What about Tobias? Well, Tobias, did he think about it? Did he not think about it? Let's say he has actually been thinking about this, and then if she doesn't cheat, like what are the chances that he asks her? Blah, blah. Let's assume that Tobias actually suffers a little bit more because they don't cheat. So he gets like a -2, right? And Lucas, well, if she doesn't cheat, then Lucas certainly never finds out about it. It goes on as things would have gone on. So Lucas basically gets a 0 here. And then we'd have to figure out, of course, we could go on and do this in further iterations of the different possibilities that would come out. But at this point, we'll stop there. And we'll say that, so no cheat ends up between a -2, -1, and a 0, so we get a total of -3. And at this point, according to our hedonic calculus, it is absolutely clear. Katie, cheat, and cheat like the wind! Every chance you get, go cheat. I mean, I don't know if we actually did the calculations right, because we'd have to figure out for different people, but in general, we've just done some really basic hedonic calculus. So this tells us both how incredibly complicated this gets really fast, and maybe it raises some questions about whether we can actually calculate our own happiness and pleasure, and whether Aristotle was right, and this is kind of an oversimple picture of what morality might be like. But in any case, okay, so at this point I've said a lot about utilitarianism, and I've filled your head with thoughts of cheating on your significant other or spouse. So I'm going to claim that the first lecture over Bentham has been successful. I'm going to take a break, allow you to take a break, and I'll come back in a minute to talk more about Jeremy Bentham and utilitarianism.